In 30 BC, Herod's patron Mark Antony took poison and died in his lover's arms. He did so knowing that Herod, the man he had called his friend, had already betrayed him. No sooner had Mark Antony been defeated at Actium than Herod sought a new alliance with his enemy Octavian. Herod's future rested on his ability to win the patronage of the new power in Rome.
He goes explicitly without any of the paraphernalia of his royal status, without his crown, without his robes. He goes, in effect, cap in hand before Octavian. And he says, in effect, I make no apology. I was a supporter of Mark Antony's. I should have been at Actium. I would have been fighting on Mark Antony's side. I was loyal to Mark Antony during that whole period. But now, he said, I will offer my loyalty to you. I will be loyal from now on to Octavian. And the same kind of loyalty that I showed to Mark Antony will now be shown to you. Octavian, surprisingly in some ways, accepts the offer and confirms him in his kingship, offers him more lands to rule.
It appeared to have been yet another triumph for Herod's silver tongue. But Octavian's remarkable open-handedness towards the friend of his old enemy may have had more to do with chests of silver. Octavian was bankrupt.
Herod came in with at least 700 talents of pure silver. 1 talent is 30 kilos, as much as one man can carry. Huge amount of money. And from this background, it is quite obvious that it was not a problem for Augustus to keep Herod in power.
One of the main items in the file which shows that Herod was a wonderful diplomat was the way he was able to save himself time and again after he had been backing the wrong Roman.
Herod had a new sponsor and even more territory. He returned to Judea in triumph, but his joy was to be short-lived. There were rumors that his wife, Mariamne, the woman he loved more than anything, had a lover.
And Herod became convinced that in his absence, Mariamne had had an affair and was in fact trying to visions in any rational, intelligent way.
Herod had Mariamne executed. It may have been a politically useful marriage, but Herod was also obsessed with her. He took to the wilderness in despair, his will to live extinguished.
He goes into a deep, deep depression and himself almost dies as a result of that very tragic incident, something that he seems never to have quite gotten over.
With the death of Mariamne, Herod had reached a turning point. Henceforth, he abandoned all efforts at impressing the Jewish elite with his Hasmonean connections. He could never change what he was, but he could glorify his name with monuments that would last forever.
The main thing to remember is that kings in antiquity had 2 avenues of getting themselves a place in posterity. They could either do wars, or they could build, or they could do both. And Herod, as a vassal king, was not allowed to be involved in wars. He had no option of a foreign policy of his own. The only thing he could do was build, and he built massively.
The more difficult the location or outrageous the engineering required, the happier it made Herod. There had long been a mountaintop stronghold overlooking the Dead Sea at Masada. Herod transformed it into a luxurious palace complex that appeared to taunt gravity.
450 meters high, flat-top mountain. Unbelievable sight, absolutely. With its northern palace, always in shade, with a sauna hanging on the cliff with a beautiful view over the Dead Sea. Just marvelous play of environment and space and classical architecture.
Herod was a creative man with an eye for form and function and the resources to realize his most outrageous visions. he required his architects to think the unthinkable.
This is one of the quite a few buildings where I claim that the great idea is not in particular the one that an architect brought up. You have to learn in a school to do it this way. It's just a logic and imagination together, and Herod had both of them in tons.
But the greatest example of creativity from this most destructive of kings was a feat of engineering so audacious it places him amongst the greatest builders of the ancient world. On a coastline without any natural foothold, he created a vast artificial deep-sea port.
What Herod did was unprecedented, not only among the Jewish people, but rarely repeated by anybody else, including the vast and mighty Roman Empire.
Avner Rabban of Haifa University believes Herod's port of Caesarea should be counted amongst the 7 wonders of the world.
I mean, the pyramids are by far more protruded, more impressive, but much less functional.
Herod knew that to become a great trading nation, Judea had to use the Mediterranean. He could then steal business from Alexandria, but first he needed to change Jewish thinking about the sea.
To build a harbor of such a scale, following a very terrestrial, non-maritime tradition of his Jewish people, that this is what made this harbor so unique.
The secret of his extraordinary design lay in a Roman innovation, volcanic ash cement that hardened in seawater. Herod's engineers filled hundreds of wooden pontoons with the powder and sank them to form the foundations for the new harbor. Today, only divers can examine the remaining traces of the ancient artificial reef. They have survived for 2,000 years, but above the surface, there is little left to see.
First of all, forget about the modern one. Just in the middle of nowhere, in relation to the ancient one. What you have from the ancient one, if you see down here, this nicely cut, flat, what seemed to be bedrock, it's actually the top of the Herodian mole that continues, or let's say a quarter mile further west, turning half a mile to the north, so it's rather large area. It's about 40 hectares of confined ocean.
Until Herod's bold move, a late harvest in Egypt meant grain-carrying ships bound for Rome had to brave winter seas. Now they had a safe haven in which to sit out the storms. It was an instant success. The harbor became a giant cash machine for Judea and a source of pride to Herod.
One has to imagine what sense of achievement it would be to take an ocean like that, uncontrolled, wild, effective, and disciple it into well-confined, well-protected, beautifully function an instrumental entity to serve the Lord's demand, and the Lord in this particular case was Herod the Great.
Caesarea started as a harbor and became a city. It was Herod's ideal world, a secular metropolis where it didn't matter where you came from. Caesarea wasn't just built by Herod, it represented everything he stood for.
And so it was a city that looked in its direction westwards across the Mediterranean at the same time as it was drawing trade in from the east towards it and acting as a great warehouse area. So it's a very liberal city. There are Jews living in the city. There's a small Jewish community, but the city itself is understood to be a city that is built essentially for a Gentile population.
Caesarea was, and still is, a boomtown for the middle classes, commuting to destinations all around the Mediterranean and beyond.
Well, Josephus says that Herod built Caesarea for the hipparchy and the harbor for the navigators. Caesarea, it's natural that it attracted people that could sense that they can grasp the opportunity of prosperity. And of course, there were Gentiles, there were Samaritans, Phoenicians came, Syrians, Greek, from all over the Mediterranean to settle here. The period was very open.
I think basically, when you look at Caesarea in a big way, Herod built it to be a opposite balance, a counterpoint to Jerusalem. And you have on the coast Caesarea, and you have inland in Jerusalem, as it were, God's city. You have Caesar city and God's city. The way the rabbis of the Talmud will eventually put it, they will say that Jerusalem and Caesarea, when one goes up, the other goes down.
28 years into his reign, Herod was entitled to feel pleased with himself. He'd rebuilt the city of God and created a city of business. The Romans were pleased and his subjects were rich. But the remaining years of his reign would be characterized by murder and madness. As he reached his 60s, Herod could look back with satisfaction. He'd kept Rome happy, made his nation rich, and built monuments that would last forever. But the future was less certain. Herod couldn't decide who should succeed him, and in his paranoia became suspicious that his children were plotting against him. In 14 BC, Herod was so desperate for someone he could trust that he brought back a wife and a son he'd banished 30 years previously. Doris and 4-year-old Antipater had been thrown out when he wanted Mariamne. Now, Antipater would become a front-runner in the battle for the throne. Herod's next 2 sons, Alexander and Aristobulus, were his children by Mariamne. They were also strong contenders, but Herod didn't trust them. They were Hasmonean aristocrats.
Part of the background was some snootiness on their part that they, in fact, had been educated in Rome. And he was this provincial type who was getting old and hadn't had a very good education and hadn't really spent much time in the big city at all. I think that was probably part of it.
They were named as his successors in his early wills, and it was clear that they would, in fact, take over. Herod thought they were scheming against them. My guess is that there's probably some truth to that suspicion on his part. Herod thought that they were trying to win over the support of the army.
It didn't help matters that he'd executed their mother. They may have heard the rumors that ever since her death, he'd kept her body embalmed in a jar of honey, and that in his madness, he visited her at night to continue their relationship. For years, Herod tried to get along with them, but they would always be a threat. In 7 BC, his temper got the better of him, and he had the scheming pair strangled.
If we want to say something for him in his favor, he was a politician, and he was for him was important to have the power. So everything was related to, as a king, to power, and so he could kill wife, no brothers, not the case, but the sons, friends, and so on, and relatives, because he saw that there were some possibilities that they were working against his rule.
The account of the Magi who come to Judea seeking a new Jewish king. When they do that, they naturally go to Jerusalem.
Herod listened with growing fury when they spoke of a star and a prophecy. According to the Gospel of St. Matthew, he played innocent. Go and find out all about the child, and when you have found him, let me know, so that I too may go and do him homage.
Well, it's the story of the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem and the massacre of the innocent infants in Bethlehem is certainly the most famous story about Herod, which people on the street will know.
According to the Bible, Herod's soldiers advanced on Bethlehem, but God had warned Joseph in a dream, and the Holy Family escaped to Egypt. The king's revenge was swift. Herod was furious when he realized he'd been outwitted, and in Bethlehem and its surrounding district, he had killed all the male children who were 2 years and under. Herod was at times a bloody king, but did he order the massacre of the innocents? We only have a few lines in Matthew's Gospel as evidence. The Gospel of St. Luke confirms that Jesus was born in the time of Herod, but doesn't mention the mass killing of the baby boys. Josephus, from whom we know so much about Herod, and who delights in cataloguing the king's darker deeds, never mentions the slaughter at all.
Somebody like that would seem to be such a monster that other stories like this can easily be made up about him.
I myself have some question about whether or not that incident in Matthew actually took place.
Herod, the evil tyrant of the Nativity story, was certainly guilty of murdering those who threatened his throne. But it is possible that the massacre of the innocents, as told by Matthew, never took place. Whether the details of the story are true or not, there's evidence that in the last years of Herod's reign, he began killing on an unprecedented scale, settling scores and murdering political rivals. The period of Herod's greatest atrocities coincides with his own physical decay.
Remember that he is almost 70 years of age. That's a very advanced age for somebody. He must have been a very strong man through most of his life to have survived that long. Now I think his whole body is giving up, and his mind is perhaps giving up at the same time.
Herod was carried here, to his newest palace in Jericho. The record speaks of a sickness with the hallmarks of an Old Testament plague.
Josephus gives a very graphic description of a painful illness focusing on the stomach and also on the mind of Herod. He's going out of his mind. He's going out of his mind in pain. He's stinking. Some versions will tell us about worms as well. And his flesh is decaying.
From his deathbed, Herod embarked on an orgy of violence. It began when word reached him that a high-spirited mob had torn down the Roman eagle he had placed provocatively above one of the entrances to the Temple Mount.
Some young students took the opportunity at the urging of one of their teachers to remove that eagle from the temple, viewing it as offensive. They did so, and of course Herod's retribution fell very quickly. He executed the students, he executed the teacher who was responsible for encouraging them. It was a rather perhaps unnecessary action on his part, but one that seemed to him essential because it challenged his authority.
Impatient for power, Doris's son Antipater now tried to mount a palace coup that would put him on the throne. Herod's firstborn, the son he had brought back from exile to succeed him, had jumped too soon. His father rallied, finding the strength to order his immediate execution. Herod had just 5 days to live, but he had a lot more killing to do. All his life he'd been rejected by the Jewish aristocracy, and now he'd get his revenge.
In his dying days, Herod ordered Jewish nobles to be brought down to Jericho, where he is, and when he dies, to execute them all. His sister refuses to carry out this command.
In his palace, courtiers attended him round the clock. Neither prayers nor potions made any difference. Driven mad by pain, Herod attempted to end his misery with a blunt fruit knife. Like most rulers of the time, Herod had used violence to stay in power. But the insane bloodlust of his last days stands out. "2,000 years after his death, modern science suggests that Herod's violence and paranoia may have been directly linked to his physical disease. At the Veterans Hospital in Seattle, pathologist Jan Hirschman has studied the accounts of Herod's last days. He believes the lurid details mask a description of actual symptoms. Herod's final killing spree might have been the result of acute kidney disease that literally drove him mad.
In Josephus's case, he describes Herod as becoming increasingly depressed, actually attempting suicide unsuccessfully, and becoming more paranoid. And all these features have been seen in patients with untreated chronic kidney disease.
As Herod's kidneys shrank to half their size, his body would have been engulfed by poisons.
Presumably, this is what Herod's kidney would have looked like when he had chronic kidney disease. He was in an enormous amount of discomfort, partly because of the itching, secondly because of the abdominal pain, which again was very severe, third because of the movements of his limbs, which again was described as being very uncomfortable.
Josephus also speaks of the royal genitals producing worms. Herod's madness is even more understandable. He may have had gangrene of the scrotum.
When this gangrene occurs in the genital area, sometimes the surface of the scrotum, the whole skin, sloughs off, leaving bare the material underneath. And for somebody unfamiliar with the anatomy of the male genitalia, what is seen after the scrotum is removed is what looks very worm-like.
When Herod finally died, he was taken to the only site he'd named after himself. Herodium was a palace sunk in the top of a man-made mountain. Below it, awe-inspiring pleasure gardens where his marble tomb lay waiting, where thousands of soldiers and courtiers waited as he was interred, or may have been. According to Josephus, his golden casket lies somewhere here, but it has yet to be found. Herod's death left a vacuum his heirs couldn't fill. Within a century, the Romans were burning his temple and persecuting the Jews. Perhaps the stability he created is Herod's best monument.
I'm sure Herod would have rather have died about 7-8 years earlier than he really did die. Had that been the case, he would have died as somebody who kept the peace, built monumental things all over the country which remained, and that last decade of troubles with his family and killing too many people would not have occurred.
A man of complex origins, always the outsider, Herod worked tirelessly to unite subjects of all backgrounds. Did he succeed where so many other rulers of his land have failed?
With the Gentiles and with the Jews, he achieved a lot. He was the person who could rule this country in the best way, and I don't think that in the before and after we had such a personality who could unite such a difficult region.
Herod longed for recognition and appreciation, but he achieved neither. 2,000 years later, in spite of his creative achievements, he is only remembered for ordering an act of cold-blooded murder that may never have happened at all.